Greetings everybody, Marcus Godwin here with the Shroom Vremeni Noise of Time blog. So, after last weekend's Victory Day celebrations finished in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin gave a pretty long and pretty comprehensive press conference in which he said some very interesting things about the events surrounding the Istanbul negotiations between Ukraine and Russia after the first month of the beginning of the special military operation, which I must emphasize and remind everyone was actually Russia's official entry into a civil war in Ukraine that had been going on and was started by the West in April of 2014. So it had been going on for 8 years until this happened. So anyway, Russia forces finally enter Ukraine from many different directions, including from the direct north, where many of them entered suburban areas of the city of Kiev itself. During these Istanbul negotiations, which were pretty much everyone who was there on both sides agreed that peace could have been found at this moment. Everything that Russia wanted, the Ukrainians agreed to. Neutrality for Ukraine, no NATO, the right of the people of Donbass, while remaining in the what I call fake state of Ukraine, would have total autonomy in their own education systems, to use the language, their native language, which is Russian, of course. The Russian Orthodox Church would no longer be persecuted, harassed, or attempts to close it down and so on and so forth would stop, etc., etc., etc. And the denazification of Ukraine, well, Ukrainian officials signed, at least initialed is the word we get, this agreement. The first thing that happened, or something which I didn't know about until President Putin started talking about it, was that Emmanuel Macron, degenerate president of France, phoned directly Vladimir Putin and said, look, you can't really expect the Ukrainians, the poor little Ukrainians who've been bombing the people of Donbass for 8 years, you can't really expect them, can you, to sign an agreement while they have a gun at their head. Why don't you withdraw your troops from around Kiev? Vladimir Putin thought about it, thinking that the peace agreement would be signed, and gave the order for Russian troops to withdraw from Kiev. Now, a few days after that, of course, we know that Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of Great Britain, flew into Kiev, spoke with Zelensky, and persuaded him not to sign anything because Russia is incredibly weak, much weaker than it looks. The Russian people don't want this campaign in Ukraine at all. They're going to rise up and just keep on fighting, and everything's going to be okay. Russia will be defeated. Well, here we are, more than 4 years later, and well over 1 million people dead, most of them on the so-called Ukrainian side, except unfortunately most of the dead are actually really just Russian people who are brainwashed into believing there's something called Ukrainian, to the point where they were actually prepared to fight and die for this. In the beginning, a lot of them joined up, absolutely. Now, of course, Ukraine is having to drag people off the streets, and many Ukrainians are living abroad. Those who fled to the West are now under threat of being rounded up and sent back to fight in the army until the very last Ukrainian. So those people, those citizens of so-called Ukraine who fled to the West, should have come to Russia. Only here are you going to be safe. Only here are you going to be free from the thought of being forced back into the Ukrainian army, heaven forbid. And here you are not a foreigner, actually. In spite of everything that happened since 1991, the peoples of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine have all been living together for pretty much 1,000 years. So anyway, what I want to talk about here is, we know about the peace agreement was scuppered. I knew it was scuppered by Boris Johnson. He's still going around denying it. But then Epstein Islanders are, as we know, pathological liars, as all Satanists are, because Satan is the great deceiver, after all. Let us not forget. I've just seen recently, even this afternoon, I don't know when he made this video, another video where he's trying to deny that it's down to him. Of course, Biden was behind him, and the American neocons and the entire British establishment and Brussels establishment, they all knew what they were doing. So it looks like a coordinated action between Macron and Boris Johnson, who got, above all, Russian troops to withdraw from Kiev. I'm not a military expert by any means, but many who are say, in fact, there were not really enough Russian troops to actually take Kiev by force, especially maybe in the beginning. But it was called a feint, in fact. It was absolutely enough to scare the Ukrainians into thinking this is really serious, that they could lose their state completely, their capital city could be taken over by Russia, and after all, Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. That's where the Kiev Rus began. That's where, after the first baptism of Grand Prince Vladimir into Orthodoxy, into Christianity, in other words, in 988, later the same year or the next year, there was a mass baptism in Kiev, and Russia became a Christian country at that time, and Kiev was the capital of the new Christian state known as the Kiev Rus. At exactly the same time, of course, the Great Schism was about to happen, as we could say, and this meant, in fact, that the Roman Catholic Church left the Church of Christ, set up as an alternate Church of Christ. And it's from that date in 1054 that we can trace back the Western Europe's rape, pillage, enslavement and genociding tour of the whole world as the technology got better and better, so Europeans and Westerners could spread out across the whole world. At the time, of course, their first target was Orthodox England, which they invaded in 1066 and forced the population of England by extreme violence to convert to the newfangled post-schism Catholicism. The peoples of Wales, Scotland and of the island of Ireland would follow suit. So remember, all those countries were Orthodox countries. The populations were Orthodox. Populations of the British Isles were all Orthodox Christians for at least 6 centuries before 1066. So what was happening there was Russia was gaining Christianity just at the same time as Western Europe was losing it. And it's not only me, but many other people believe that this is actually the cause of the constant Western attacks on Russia over the last 1,000 years. However, let's get back to this particular attack on Russia. So Macron and Johnson organised this between them. The Russians, foolishly, as many have commented, yet again taken in by Western lies. Yet again fooled by Western lies. That's what it is to be a Christian, to be someone who trusts when a serious person, a politician of a so-called serious country like Great Britain or France, says something, Russian people believe it. Still. Maybe not now, but we will see. So this is what happened. Now, I want to get on to one particular aspect of this, which is very important. So Russian troops withdrew from various suburban areas of Kiev, including one which has the interesting name from an Anglo-Saxon English native speaker point of view, has the name of Bucha. Now, this became infamous, of course, for an apparent massacre which was supposed to have taken place there. People certainly died there. But let's go back to the beginning. I guess it must have been about 3 weeks ago now, on the so-called anniversary of this so-called massacre, a whole gaggle of Western leaders, European leaders, and mainstream Western journalists trooped off to Kiev and were taken to Bucha and all gathered together to take photo opportunities, saying such things as, we must never forget this terrible, atrocious Russian action, this massacre by Russian troops, etc., etc. We must never let the memory of those people who died fade away. We will keep it alive. Russia must be brought to book for this terrible crime. Except that every single Western politician and every single Western journalist who made up that decrepit gaggle knew and knows perfectly well that Russia did not kill those people at all, that the whole thing is a total lie, a total false flag, organized in advance by the West and their Ukrainian partners. Now, after the Russians withdrew, the next day I remember seeing film of the Safari Battalion. This is one of the neo-Nazi battalions which, on the advice of Joe Biden, when he was Secretary of State under President Obama, the Ukrainians put at the top of their military structures. So this Azov Battalion, Safari Battalion, Gaidar Battalion, if I'm not mistaken, etc. They became the ruling societies in Ukraine, because the ordinary Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war in 2014 did not want to fight the people of Donbass or other areas of eastern Ukraine any more than the people of Donbass wanted to fight them. And on arriving there, many of them just gave up or changed sides and actually joined the Donbass armies, etc., etc., etc. So Biden told them, get these ultra-racist neo-Nazis in place, let them run the show, we will help you, we will structure your army with these guys at the top. So this Safari Battalion came rolling in with their armoured cars and so on, pushed, some streets were littered with broken vehicles, etc., etc. What they were not littered with the next day was any dead bodies lying around. And the commander of this battalion and some other soldiers were sort of shouting triumphantly about their great victory over Russia and their recapture of the town of Bucha. Well, of course, the Russians had actually peacefully withdrawn under orders from their president the day before. But they seemed very triumphant, these Safari Battalion soldiers, and they were talking to some residents who were very friendly with them, and they said, now we're going to look for the collaborators. And it seems, beyond pretty much any shadow of a doubt, that actually the dead bodies, and there were real dead bodies in the end lined up on the street in the fourth day, but we'll come to that in a minute, were people killed by this Safari Battalion because their neighbours snitched on them, saying things like, yeah, they were letting a Russian soldier use the toilet, or talking to them across the garden fence, gave them a glass of water or a cup of tea or something like this, etc., etc., etc. So they became collaborators. The Safari Battalion killed a certain amount of people. Then 2 days after this, and now on the third day, the mayor of this city turns up making a big video, also absolutely triumphant about this glorious Ukrainian military victory that took back their city in the suburbs of Kiev called Bucha. Now, what a surprise, of course, as has been pointed out many times, they chose the town of Bucha because the name sounds like the English word butcher, as in people who have committed atrocities, who butcher other people in military atrocities, etc., etc., etc. This is why that place was chosen above all, because it is the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking world that they are interested in convincing of this massacre. So also, when the mayor is making his triumphant video walking around the town, no dead bodies. No dead bodies lying anywhere. The next day, suddenly there are dead bodies, and a whole gaggle of Western journalists have been bussed in to film and report on this massacre. Now another massive propaganda campaign is about to begin. The journalists arrived too early and saw Ukrainian soldiers arranging the dead bodies in various places in the street for the right kind of photo opportunity, etc., etc., etc. Only one of them, a French journalist called Adrien Bauque, if I'm not mistaken, understood what was happening and said, I can't do this. Every other Western journalist knew that the lie was being prepared in front of them. They filmed the lie, they reported the lie, they got paid for the lie, and they've been doing it ever since. Adrien Bauque took another path. He decided, I want to see things from the other side, so he got himself a visa to Russia, went to Russia and entered Donbass from the other side, where he was reporting for a very long time. So let me recap again. Every single one of those politicians and Western journalists we saw commemorating the 4th anniversary of the massacre of Bucha, they all know perfectly well that Russia did not kill any of those people. And in fact, Russia did not massacre anywhere Ukrainian people in the streets, shooting them down in the back with their hands tied behind the back. This did not happen. The Western politicians and Western journalists know this. They are lying to you right into your face, paid for by your money, dear Westerners. They knew perfectly well that in fact their own side, the Ukrainian army and the Safari battalion, were almost certainly the killers of these people. There is a theory, I have to say, that these bodies were brought from fighting at the front line in Donbass. I can't totally discount that, I wasn't there after all, but I think it's highly unlikely simply because that's actually quite far away and driving them there would take some considerable hours. It's at least 1,000 kilometers from Kiev to Donbass. And we know that this Safari battalion was looking for revenge on collaborators. And actually the Russian troops that were in various places around Kiev found interesting situations. Some small areas were ferociously pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian. Others were 50-50, and some areas of the suburbs of Kiev were actually very welcoming of Russian soldiers. After all, there's all sorts of people living there. They've been part of Russia for 1,000 years. They have the same church, the same religion, etc., etc., etc. So that's it. When Macron phoned Putin and asked him to withdraw his troops from the suburbs of Kiev, he almost certainly knew that Bucha had already been chosen for this false flag and that another massive anti-Russia propaganda campaign was going to be launched. But the Russians have a fault in this. Yeah, they believed it. They believed Macron. That they believed him. And it seems President Putin is very bitter about this now. But I have to say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you have very extensive intelligence services and information services, of which you yourself were for a long time a very professional part. We Westerners can't understand. We cannot understand. I remember meeting a lot of other people in Moscow from the Duran, etc., way back in 2019, maybe even 2018. And all of us understood that negotiations with the West just won't work because the West has only one goal: the total destruction of Russia and its depopulation by a lot of people. They've been doing this for 1,000 years, actually, one way or another, but I haven't got time to go into all of that now. So anyway, this was a very interesting revelation about the phone call from Macron and the Bucha false flag and Boris Johnson's entry into Istanbul and into Kiev to scupper the Istanbul peace process and continue the war. That is all history. So that's all for today. Thank you very much. May your God go with you. Goodbye.